So anyway, good afternoon and welcome to the program, Mystery After Manzanar, which features a conversation with the award-winning mystery novelist, public historian, and journalist, Naomi Hirahara. This is presented by Densho, along with the Tadaima Project and Elliott Bay Books. My name is Brian Niiya. I'm the content director for Densho. And we're going to be talking with Naomi about her new novel, Clark and Division, set in the resettlement era Chicago, but also about kind of our mutual interest in this post-camp resettlement period in which the book is set. And also, I really want to get to some of her earlier books, both some of her other earlier mystery novels, a substantial body of nonfiction books on various aspects of Japanese American history, and maybe your days as a journalist, which is when we first met, and as I learned recently, even as an actor. As we go along, please feel free to comment or jot down questions, which we'll respond to as many as we can. So with that, welcome Naomi, and congratulations on Clark and Division. As you know, I think it's really, you did a terrific job on it.
Thank you.
The book itself looks really, really nice. It's just such a handsome jacket, and the map thing works really nicely. So yeah, I think our camp nerd audience will really, really enjoy it. So could you just give us your kind of one paragraph kind of summary of the book?
Sure. Clark and Division is a book about sisters, and it's also specifically about a Japanese American family, the Ito family, who from an area called Tropical, which is actually around, if you know Los Angeles, it's kind of around the Atwater area, so close to Los Angeles and Glendale. The reason why I picked Tropical was I was interviewing a Nisei long decades ago, and he said he was from Tropical. I go, where's that? And that just conversation, just planted Tropical in my mind. So I was trying to find the best book to place it in, and it turned out to be Clark and Division. It was also one of the early places where Japanese immigrants, Issei, had gone into strawberry farming, which is so historically of interest. And then it's also an area where my husband had worked as an educator near Marshall High School. So for all of those reasons, it became Tropical. And so during World War II, the father, Gitaro Ito, works as a manager for the produce market. And during World War II, they go into, they're forcibly removed from their homes, and they are sent to Manzanar. And from there, there's early release. So the older sister, this book is told from the younger sister's point of view, Aki, and she idolizes her older sister, Rose. And Rose is the one who does the early release, and she goes to Chicago, which was the #1 destination for Nisei from the 10 mass incarceration camps. And the rest of the Ito family, Aki and her parents follow some months later, only to discover something tragic has happened to Rose. So now it's up to Aki, who's always been in the shadow of her older sister, to pull her, to find out the truth, as well as to carry her parents through this tumultuous period of their lives. So that's, yeah, the main description.
Yeah, and I know it's hard to, in some ways, talk about mystery novels because you kind of want to not give away too much, but you want to give enough so people kind of get a sense of it. So yeah, I love the Tropical reference too. I mean, it just sounds so great. And I had never even heard of it until you mentioned, I think I thought it was a made up thing, but that was a real place. So now it's a little bit of a departure for you in the sense that I don't think you haven't really written other purely historical novels, right? Even though Masarai books have a lot of flashback scenes and stuff. Where was the origin, or where did the seed for this one come from?
I think, yeah, I was kind of avoiding straight historical fiction. And so one reason why is I love the contemporary voice. I love writing about like spam musubi, or just, people, the weird way, Niseis dried their persimmons, on the clothesline, just those everyday kind of observations, I adore. So I think, and I try to put that integrated in the Masarai mysteries. But I guess it totally makes sense that I would write a historical someday because of my nonfiction work.
Sure.
And I think that it was just so important for me. And, I was kind of commissioned. I was commissioned to write a book on the gardeners. I was commissioned to write a book on the Southern California flower market, and then terminal, so all these kind of projects came my way. And I think it was very important to me to include real names of people, just maybe for their descendants to say, this is my father or grandfather or grandmother, aunt. I think that, our history, at least, beyond the rough shimples, kind of not either erased or, underplayed or hidden. So I just wanted to be in print, like this is the real name as far as I can tell. And, I think in some ways I'm not necessarily waiting, but I just thought the appropriate time for me to write fiction was, especially about the Nisei generation, is kind of the time where that generation would be no longer. Which, I know there's some Nisei that are still alive today, but
kind of now.
Yeah, but their memories may be compromised or whatever. And I have really noticed that when I interview someone in their 50s, 60s, 70s, that's really different, than when I'm talking to them in their 90s, right?
Right.
So I think maybe, emotionally or psychologically, I felt like, okay, Naomi, this is your freedom, to kind of explore this in fiction. And since I had known so many Nisei, and I know, Brian, you probably are more comfortable with the Nisei female voice than I am, because Nisei women love you because you're a spoiled Sansei boy male. Whereas I think, the relationship between a Nisei woman and a Sansei woman is a little more complicated. I didn't really experience this firsthand because my mother's Issei. So I'm kind of a Nisei, I'm a Nisei and raised by a Japanese immigrant woman. So I think in that way it gave me some insights to my character Aki. The book is written in first person. But I've been trying to crack the Nisei female voice for some time in fiction. It's been tough because, and even at Rough Shimpo, I noticed that most of the people we had on our front page, and of course there's only 4 pages, but was mostly men, and at some point I said, we need to write about more women. And I think Martha Nakagawa interviewed women about their romance in camp. And inevitably, this is what happened. We would get calls before the story ran. Can you please take out that part? Or people having cold feet. And I was like, whoa. And it was such a different experience than writing from I don't want to make any generalizations, but this is my observation. Whereas Nisei men would I want my viewpoint, in there, put this in there. And it was very different for women. So my conclusion is, for these women, their social networks it's so important. And to somehow have something in print and someone saying, can you believe she said this? That there would be larger ramifications, for their opinions to be out there. So anyway, because I was not raised by a Nisei woman who survived camp, I don't know if that would help or hinder me, but I've been chasing, how do I, because I noticed there was this level of optimism, yet I know there was so much trauma that had occurred. So how do I poke this veneer? And I had written a short story, a noir short story called The Chirashi Covenant. and it was set in 1950s. They were all beauty queens. I wanted to write about more attractive people because I'm very drawn to unattractive people. And so it's like, okay, they were former, like, Nisei Week type queens in 1941, and this is 10 years later. So let's take a look at them. What has happened. And in that one, there's a kind of a femme fatale who has an affair with a white guy. She's married with a kid with children, and she eventually chops that white guy up and puts him into a suitcase and drops him into the ocean. And some people who really like dark noir, outside of the community liked it, but I think everyone else, I don't think most people read it, but the ones who did were probably puzzled and not really thinking that is my aunt or mother or it wasn't representative. So it was like, well, how, I tend to write mysteries. How do I write this kind of character? And it wasn't until, I was working on Life After Manzanar and reading about, the criminal activities that had taken place by young people, in Chicago and without parental supervision. And that's when it really occurred to me, like, this is it. This is how I could write the Niiyas. The character has optimism, has filial piety and all these things, but the outside forces are very dark. So how is she going to interact with that?
Yeah, no, that's what I think you do really well in this novel. That it really, really captures that sense of being a Nisei at that point in time. That, as you mentioned, this mixture of just, just terrible living conditions. They're in this, living conditions that may or may not be better than camp. There are jobs, but they're all kind of menial. And of course, then you've got this family tragedy on your hands. And at the same time, yeah, you're right. The sense of optimism, excitement, just freedom, right? That for so many of the Nisei. So it's kind of, it really captures that sense of that resettlement period really, really well, better than I think almost any other fiction or nonfiction work. And, it's this kind of coming of age novel at the same time as it's a mystery. And, before you mentioned that, I hadn't really thought of it, that, yeah, it's true. Your protagonists have not been Nisei women. They haven't been major characters in a lot of your books. It's been, your grouchy kibe, retired gardener, and younger women. And so yeah, that is interesting. I hadn't thought of that. So was there any doubt you're going to write about Chicago, or did you consider, like, New York, Denver? I mean, there were other kind of major resettlement hubs as well.
I was and I'll get to this later. I was thinking about Bronzeville,
Sure.
Yeah. For sure. But then the accounts, I wasn't really getting this through line of that the Nisei had been exposed to a lot of crime. I mean, I am a mystery writer, yes, so I am looking for kind of dark things. Yes. And I, there were families that were returning together. So I think, and it was a slightly different time. So I think that was the difference. I think Chicago, just being such a notorious place, just the mob and how ethnically it's so interesting, like the Polish community, the Irish community, all those, that whole city. I mean, it's so different than Los Angeles, when I don't think people say I'm Polish, it's not the same kind of demographic over here. And I think finding that document with the Chicago Resettlers Committee, that I think it was 1946, where it just had this list of, people having babies out of wedlock, and then abortions, which were illegal at the time, and several other very specific crimes. It was, I mean, I didn't do like heavy duty research. I just read that and I said, this is crazy. I had never really heard about, I knew, of course, like through the children's village, there were babies, there were interracial babies born out of red. I was cognizant of that, but the other types of crimes, I was kind of shocked and surprised. And then I went back to the same oral histories, as you know, regenerations, and the Japanese American National Museum has done an excellent job, led by Art Hansen and Darcy Iki, and kind of doing that at a very important time where people could actually tell their story. But I was reading like around the edges, they would say, oh yeah, there was a little skirmish. There was a little fight, it wasn't the center of the oral history, but there were, once I kind of became more aware that there were very, specific criminal problems, delinquencies. And then when I look back, it's like, oh, people are referencing it, but not very directly, and us being Japanese American observers, we're very used to it, right? Reading between the lines. So yeah, so that's why I knew it had to be Chicago. There's also the Chicago police, it's very notorious. And when I was doing research on like abortions, it's kind of like, I think this is more my journalistic side. Even with the Masarai, they weren't the Masarai books, although I have a personal opinion, they weren't like I wasn't making a political statement on nuclear weapons. That wasn't, it's part of my own family history. It's real, it happened. So that's what I wanted to write about. And in the abortion issue too, it's like it was real, it happened. And Japanese American Nisei women were having them. So it wasn't necessarily a political agenda, although some might approach it that way. They might want to write about it for that reason, but it was more like this was happening. And one of the nonfiction books that I read was centered, it was a coincidence. It just centered on Chicago at that time. So, I think when I do these projects, and I don't know if you probably experience this too, it's like things come up that are just related, just magically, serendipitously, so it's like confirmation. It's probably more, JA world is very small.
Yes.
If you start asking one thing, it's something related's going to come at you. But yeah, but that's really what's happened with all my book projects. And that's what happened with Clark and Division too.
I'm curious, did you look at the Charles Kikuchi oral histories too?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, because that, when I read those initially, that just blew my mind, just changed my opinion of the Nisei, because this was the kind of unpolished, raw side that you just, when you talk to them, 40 years later, you don't see that.
He was a bit snarky.
Absolutely.
Especially his observations on women.
Yes, always about their appearance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
So that was, yeah.
So, and those are all now available online, the kind of unexpurgated versions at Berkeley as part of their JERS archive, which is interesting. It's a great resource. But yeah. I was also wondering, were you influenced at all by other? Because there've been a handful of other works on this period. I think we both are admirer of Pineapple White, John Shirota's, novel set in L.A. in the late 40s. But were there other works like that were significant for you?
Well, it's interesting in my interview with Frank Abe, he brought up No No Boy, as a post. And it's weird.
It is.
I didn't really consider it. Right. Of course it is.
Yeah, right.
Yes, but I'm sure, that I read in college. So, you just don't know how these things kind of influence you. But I'm sure that did have its an effect. But I was searching for Monica Sone, Nisei daughter,
Yes.
that it takes a similar trajectory as this book, as Clark and Division, but the tone is like totally different. Yeah. So, yeah, I would have to say probably, probably No No Boy did have its effect on it in some ways that I'm not even probably totally aware of. And I'm a big fan of Hisaye, and I think that her work, and she's written short stories on, she's written some post-camp stories too, which are just devastating. I mean, she's, just such a queen, I think.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the main stories of hers that are constantly anthologized and written about are the pre-war and then the one wartime story. But yeah, there's some less appreciated post-war pieces that she did.
Like the one, I think there was in Little Los Angeles, in the bus or the,
Wilshire bus you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. That's, I looked at that recently. It was like an amazing. Yeah, Hisaye Yamamoto de Soto, for the ones who are unfamiliar with their work, 17 syllables. Hisaye used to, she still wrote some stories for us when I was at Rafushimpo for the holiday issue.
You're that old.
I am that old. I am old enough to have watched the Japanese section set, by hand. The lead type. And then I was not working. I had quit, and then the earthquake had happened in San Gabriel or something, and then all the type like fell, but they eventually transitioned. But yeah, so I think that I feel lucky that I knew Hisaye. I mean, it's not like we were best buddies or anything, but she was on my Rolodex. And, we would get her, hand typed material. And yeah, Fire in Fontana is published when I was there. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a couple of unanthologized pieces she did in the Rafu, like in the early 60s that were, it was a period when supposedly Nisei weren't talking about camp, but, she did.
Yeah.
Even called them concentration camps, and like this 1960 story about, leaving camp as a student and then coming back to camp after a brother dies in the 442nd. So, I think some of these there needs to be another anthology of her work beyond 17 syllables, because there's a lot more there in those old Rafus.
I think she was a role model to me in the sense just of her presence. I mean, I'm a small person. I mean, just physically, she was a small person that I think was underestimated. I saw it for myself where people didn't realize who she was and didn't let her into like a talk, like, oh, we're all full. And I'm saying, this, you don't know who this is,
Right.
And but she was very unassuming, but she was a journalist too, for the African American paper. And so those, and how she was motivated by social issues in addition to her art, so I related to her, from that point of view. And I loved her, her friendship with Wakako Yamauchi.
Yes.
And I think that was meaningful to me too, to see friendship, among creative people, because so much of the time, we, I think society characterizes like female friendship as being adversary, and competitive. And it was like good model, like it doesn't have to be like that. And yeah.
I was wondering, that there are now kind of a number of Asian American mystery novelists, and is there kind of a little fraternity of you now?
The first time when Summer of the Big Bocce came out, there's a group called Sisters in Crime, and I read at like this is even before it was published, at their Christmas gathering. It's right at the South Pasadena Public Library, so really close to me. And Dale Frutani, he reached out to me, and I had his arc from working at Ralph Shimpo, his murder mystery set in Little Tokyo.
Yes.
I think it was Ken Tanaka. Was that his name?
Right.
And he was so generous. He said, Naomi, if you need a blurb, because he had won some awards within our industry, he said, I will be more than happy to do that. So it's kind of like the friendship between, Wakako and Hisaya. Here was a Japanese American man kind of extending, being very generous. So, and so I kind of took that as an example. And so when there's been other Asian American writers, like I saw that Steph Cha, Korean American writer, her Juniper Song series, which is kind of set in the Koreatown area, when it was coming out, we kind of connected, So, but now there's a group now called Crime Writers of Color, which was started by one is a East Asian mystery writer, Gigi Pandian, and then Walter Mosley and Carrie Garrett, an African American woman. So yeah, there is this larger group, and when appropriate, a smaller subset of the Asian American writers come together, and we do programming, especially during anti-Asian violence was happening, was in the news. Some of our members were very distraught. And so we did like a little fundraiser to increase awareness. But I think specific like JAs who have come out is Scott Kikawa, who's a writer of noir 1950s. And he's really great. And he's been very complimentary. He said that he was influenced by Masarai, because he said he didn't think that he loved Walter Mosley, but he didn't think, oh, there can't be anything like with Asian American or Japanese American characters. But when Masarai series came out, he goes, I recognize those people. They sit in the corner and they say nothing. No, they don't care about anything, So I think he identified with that, and he has told me that pushed him to do his own. He's in law enforcement himself, so he's written about a homicide detective in Hawaii, in Honolulu, and there is now Iris Yamashita, who's celebrated. She was nominated for an Oscar for Letters from Iwo Jima. She's coming out with her mystery. It's set in Alaska. I don't think it has necessarily Asian American characters, but it's coming out soon. And we've known each other, and so we've gotten together even during the pandemic. Recently, we got together. So I think slowly there's going to be more and more, specifically like JAs. Oh yeah, there's going to be one book out next year that's going to be set in camp with a paranormal. I haven't read it yet. A paranormal kind of sounds like the terror.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say, yeah.
Yeah, so there's more. It's written by a Hapa, so there's going to be, or a mixed race person. So there's going to be more of that in the future.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I love that. A lot that in these genres you're seeing more Asian American JA stories. Certainly there are, romance novels. I even read recently a gay romance novel with a Manzanar plot. So yeah, I think it's great to see. Now we were talking before this went live about the significance of this book to your writing, and can when we kind of cut that off, I wanted to pick that thread back up again.
So Clark and Division is published by Soho Press. Well, their crime imprint, Soho Crime, and they do actually a lot of international translations. They've done some prominent like Japanese writers And one that came out this year was Lady Joker, which is like 1,000-page. I have it. I have, they divided it into two, and I'm going to be reading it. But I think about a decade ago, they started doing more Asian American. I have two colleagues, Henry Chang and Ed Lin, both friends who live, they're Chinese Americans in New York, and they've done crime novels. So anyway, yeah, this is the first time I've worked with the publisher. This is kind of my hardcover debut, kind of. There was one Masarai that did have a hardcover release, but it was more like, let's throw that against the wall and see what happens. And also it came out like after the 2008 economic financial blow up. So books weren't doing that well. But yeah, so I think this is the right fit. I'm an old person like you. Brian. So
I was insulted by that.
But I do, true. But I've been published since 2004. I mean, that's kind of a long, and this is a brutal industry, just like so many other fields, but there's so much consolidation.
Right.
And when you write like a character, an old Japanese American gardener, who solves crimes, it's not sexy, and I have these weird titles, but I just kept going and going. And, it did occur to me, it's because more recently I've been published by smaller. My first 3 Masarais came out from an imprint of Random House, but it was paperback original. So I've been basically a paperback, writer, and which has been fine. It's affordable. It's kind of these weird, books. So, if someone wants to try it out, it's not that expensive. But yeah, with Soho, and they do such a, like you mentioned, a beautiful presentation with the maps. And I figured, okay, if people are going to have to pay like 20, close to $30, I want it to look beautiful.
Yes, and it does.
I want it, when someone does their Zoom call, they could have this in their background and feel good about it. It's decoration. It's not only a book. Yeah, so I think, and it was so bizarre because I wrote it, I finished it and rewrote it during the pandemic last year. And my editor, who I adore, she took a leave of absence during that time because Soho is a small independent publisher, but they have a distribution and sales deal with Random House. So it's kind of the best of both worlds because you have the care, but they actually have to do a presentation to the sales team at Random House. And then they decide, okay, we'll handle it this way, that way. And so just to help her colleagues, because they didn't want to, who knew, like in spring of 2020, what would be happening? Bookstores were literally closed. You could not go inside of a bookstore. We really didn't know what would be happening. So, and my editor's also a writer herself. So for various reasons, she took a leave of absence. And I'm going, well, what's going to happen with Clark and Division? And then all of these, there's various international trade kind of conferences, the London Book Fair, all of that was closing. So it's like, okay, whatever. So, but she eventually came back. We wrote it. It was supposed to come out in May of this year. And I was thinking the old way, the pre-pandemic way. I was thinking, oh, but the LA Times was, then they said, well, we're going to have to move it, to later in the year. And I'm thinking, oh, the LA Times Festival of Books is in April. It's Asian Pacific Heritage Month in May. My mind was the old way, like how, because I was doing this for so many years. So I was thinking, this is the way we market books. And they were saying, oh, we'll have to do it summer. And I finally said, I don't care, just do what you think. And they said August. And typically, like when you think August, it's not the best time for a book to come out. But we're in the pandemic. It doesn't,
Rules are different. Yeah.
Its rules were different. And then, and also people were reading books during the pandemic. Who figured? They were ordering it online, but finally now people can at least go inside of a bookstore. They're not really having in-person events, and the whole thing about virtual really helped me. I had never really spoken much to Michael Connolly in the past, but because Romans had asked me to, be his interlocutor for his book that came out last year, I was suddenly having one-on-one conversations with him. And we did another virtual event. And so when it came time for me to ask people to blurb the book, he kindly did, so.
That's great. And, it was great to see the LA Times piece and, New York Times review. I mean, that's big time.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
One thing I want to ask you about the book, well, a couple things is, are we going to see Aki again?
We are. I said this would be not a series, it would be standalone, but they wanted a follow-up.
Demand.
Yeah, there's going to be a follow-up and it's called Evergreen.
Ah, great.
And it's set in 1946, Los Angeles. Cool. So it turns out I will be covering Bronzeville.
Great.
Yeah.
And you feel, that the Nisei, you're confident enough in the Nisei women's voice to revisit.
Yeah, and I'm really excited about it. And I think what's been really advantageous for me is just having like people like you in my life. We've been working together on various projects, so I could call, if I'm looking into like PTSD of 142nd soldiers, I could just call someone up and say, hey, have you heard this? And they could say, yes, I have. And they're just verbally telling me, and they're telling me anecdotes. It's not like I'm reading it, in a book.
I don't know if I mentioned this, but I collected a lot of crimes by JAs, and there are some very, tragic ones that were committed by, say, 442nd veterans who had PTSD. They could send that to you.
Yeah, please do.
Yeah. But anyway, as we're talking, there's some real interesting discussions going on in chat, and I wanted to bring in a couple of these. And I was going to ask you this question too. This is from Chizue Shikuma, but this continues on kind of this resettlement post-camp theme, referring to Strawberry Yellow, where there has a strong subplot about Moss coming back and kind of this sort of hostel that plays a part in the book in the Watsonville area. What I didn't know that you mentioned in one of our email exchanges is this is based on part of your family history. And I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah, so, I actually wrote about it. I had a column in the Pacific Citizen, I think it's 3 Degrees of Separation or something like that, where I talk about being the city kid going, in the summers going to the country, which was Watsonville. So my father was a Kibe Nisei, and his aunt and uncle owned a beautiful Victorian house as well as farmland in Watsonville. You could see it off of the highway. And now it was eventually changed hands, and it's quite dilapidated. And occasionally you see it on Facebook pages for like haunted houses. And, people are into that kind of stuff. But it's referred to as the Redmond Hirahara house, and Redmond was the architect. And so we would go and stay at that house. My father had many great memories because when he was born in Watsonville, and when he returned after World War II, that's where he stayed. That was his home base. He was working as a farm laborer. He was a migrant, but that was his kind of home base in his early years. That's where he learned how to play football from his cousins. There were like 13 kids that, grew up in that house, and there were other Hiraharas in that general area. So yeah, so I wanted to because I didn't want this is when you write an amateur sleuth, it's kind of like Murder, She Wrote. Why are all these people dying, in this like Japanese American, even though LA is like huge, but it was like, I need to get him, out. And I was pretty much following my father's historic trajectory. And since Watsonville was part of, I had written it out, in the first summer of the Big Bachi that it was from Watsonville. So it's like, okay, let's go to Watsonville. And actually doing, I've used a lot of nonfic, doing the Manabe Hirasaki project about strawberries.
Yeah, right.
That came, that was really informed a lot of the stuff, the different varieties, the hybrid, it's high tech, which I didn't realize before. I think we're sometimes we're just very nostalgic, or we think of farming, it's just like this, I don't know, beautiful, your hands are in the soil, but no, it's very scientific and a lot of money. There's a lot of power plays between organizations, and, and that's great for a mystery, that kind of conflict. And then you have the labor issues, and this is where a lot of Latinos, right, are the main workers. And just, I think as a journalist too, I'm fascinated by those kind of complicated relationships. So, and it's nice because you can bring that in a mystery. There's got to be a lot of suspects.
And I should make clear, we're talking about a book called Strawberry Yellow, which was one of the, is it 6, 7 Masarai mysteries featuring the Kibe, retired Kibe gardener protagonist, who's I guess his special power is, as you put it, invisibility. The fact that no one notices him, so he can get places and do things ordinary people wouldn't be able to do. So the thing I love about those books is that you fill them all with, what I call gratuitous history. I mean, it's like filled with, 442nd veterans and camp reunions and pilgrimages and, Japanese Latin Americans. And it's like, seems like every important, element of JA history and the incarceration story is in there somewhere amongst the different characters. So, I'm sure that's intentional on your part.
Yeah, I think we too are about the same age. So I just feel like I wanted to document in a certain place and time in terms of these people that we knew, and certain practices that we've done. Who knows, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, it may all be gone, but at least, I put it in the story. So yeah.
Yeah, and then, hopefully, people who read them who may not know about it may be inspired to explore a little further. They can look up the Densho encyclopedia article on the topic. I was going to go to your some of your nonfiction work, but I'm going to take a couple questions because there's an interesting discussion going on in chat. But this is from Stan Yogi, who asks, what did you find most surprising from your research about JA resettlement?
Oh, that's a really good one. Well, I think what just shocked me was some images that were taken by Marian Palfy. And Brian, I think you've seen, she was a New York-based European photographer. And it was not this, very groomed, very manicured image that we've seen in so many of these resettlement photographs. It just showed like in evergreen, hostile, like these there was clothing like strewn everywhere. There was these three girls, their hair is all messed up and they don't have the same kind of plastic smile that you would see in some of the WRA, photography. I mean, I don't know why. I just mentioned that because I think emotionally that kind of pierced me. And that became like a theme, even though Clark and Division was not at Evergreen, it's in Chicago, but there's something about those images that go, there's a truth here that's not being told, and I thought that it was out there, but to see the photo, it's like, yeah, it's there, so Naomi kind of keep going. I mean, if you just read those stories about Chicago, I mean, it was really great. I was able to go to Chicago recently. And so people who had worked on the Regenerations project were there. And they said, Naomi, I could hear this person's voice. I could hear this person's voice. And one of them owned a beauty salon in Chicago. And so she was from a religious background, but she was very open to all the people who came through the door, including like the cross-dressers, that worked in the red light district. And I was going, I never knew about, these people who were interacting, the way they were interacting together was so fascinating. And I think just in Chicago specifically, the that there were more interracial relationships, right? Than we see in California. And just, it was a reminder too, that in California, things, I mean, we say that it was so open and, but it was, JAs and Asian Americans were targeted so terribly, on the West Coast. And
yeah, you always hear people in these, Midwest and Eastern cities saying that it just wasn't as racist as it was back home.
Yeah.
So. But anyway, I'm gonna go to another question. This is a fascinating one from Janice Shimokubu. Sorry, my grandfather, the UA Fuji, was found dead one evening in 1946 on the south side of Chicago. This has been a family mystery, foul play, accident, and I've always wanted to investigate his death. While writing your book, did you study a lot of Chicago murders and questionable JA deaths? Would you please be willing to share some of your findings, resources with me?
I didn't, in terms of specific incidents, I did see a record of, just like this, there was a stick-up man who was arrested, those kind of things. I did in one of, I don't know if the questioner has looked just as a starting point, just as periodicals, but there was like, I think it might have been in the Pacific Citizen, there was a Nisei who died. I mean, if you read Clark and Division, there's something that happens at a train station and there had been a death, I don't think it happened during the war. It happened maybe a few years afterwards. But I wasn't writing true crime. So I didn't do a deep dive in any of those things, but it sounds like if this is part of your family history, I think that'd be fascinating. And one thing, I think there's a lot of interest in Chicago right now. Brian, we've seen that too, right? And
yes.
And there was a special exhibition that took place at the Alpha Wood Gallery. I think it was 2017?
Yeah, a couple of the recent videos.
Yeah,
documentaries.
and just to see the interest of people, because I was there, and so I could, you could find my email address. I'll put my email address to the, I could put you in touch with some Southsiders. Maybe they can help you. But I think it's worth, I mean, it's been so many years, but I think it's worth investigating. There was, there is the case of the woman, the actress, right? I don't know, Brian. I don't know if I should even bring this up, but the mixed race actress. She's been in like, she was in some kind of soft porn stuff. But anyway, well, I'll talk
Oh,
to you later about
you
that.
thinking of Tura Satana?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you? I tried to find her because she was supposed to be in camp.
Claimed to have been in Manzanar.
I looked, and
I
tried.
did too.
You didn't find it?
No, but
Yeah,
we don't
but
know
you looked.
what we don't know
Yeah,
what name she was using. So
true, true,
yeah,
true. But I did, yeah. So yeah,
she
when
was
we're
in Faster Pussycat Kill Kill, classic
right, right,
in
right,
certain circles.
right. Yeah, but
Uh,
she had been sexually assaulted, and I think in Chicago. But yeah, I mean, there's I don't know how many of the incidents that you have on your list of criminals or crimes involved Chicago in the 40s. But
I feel like a disproportionate share, but maybe that's
okay,
just my stereotype.
yeah.
Anyway, okay, another question from Tracy Slater. Um, I've come across some documentation on a few crimes and even murders that occurred within the camps. And I wondered if you had any plans to write about in-camp crime. And if not, is there a reason beyond just that the post-camp experience seems to have gotten less attention from writers and historians? So this is the place where you want to put your creative energies?
No, I don't plan to write any fiction about that's set in camp. And I think I think the reasons after Evergreen, I don't know how many books I'll be writing around the incarceration. I'm planning to write more historicals because I found like, oh, okay, this is something I can do, and and it's been well received. I'm really interested in writing uh, in the about the early 1900s.
Hmm.
So
You have to deal
that's
with the
where,
you have to deal with the language problem with those, which I always feel writers never can get quite right.
yeah, true. But that's what I want to tackle.
Yeah.
And just because I know some Japanese, I
Right.
mean, you're
I was going to
dealing with
say, yeah.
Issei
Mhm,
stories,
mhm.
but I think
And
because
you are
I'm,
Nisei, so you have a different, yeah, you do have a different insight with that period in some ways.
yeah, and I just don't feel comfortable. I mean, I don't feel called to write. There have been some mysteries within camp that have been written, right? One was about by a white guy. What was it called? It was set in Manzanar. Do you
You're
know?
talking about the children's, the young
This
adult
was
novel?
this no, this was done maybe 25, 30 years ago.
Mhm.
But there's been a few that have been
I can't think of
in
any,
camp.
but yeah, I'm
Yeah,
sure there have been.
yeah.
So, okay, maybe you have time for one or two more. This is from Vince Schleitweiler. Naomi, reading this book, I knew I could be confident that any historical detail that I noticed was carefully researched and reliable. What was it like to try to stay true to the research while keeping the language and story so organic and believable? Was there a point when you felt that the Nisei voice really clicked for you?
Well, I think it helped that the narrator is writing this when she's narrating it when she's older. So I think that was helpful because I mean there's a clue because she says tropical, like most people in Los Angeles don't know that this is tropical today. So that's like a clue, like, oh, she's not writing this, in the 1940s. There's been some time that has elapsed. And because I think what's really hard is when referring to other racial groups, because um, you want to be accurate to the time, but then we have different sensibilities today. So there's those kind of issues, and I have friends who would advocate, you got to keep it true to the time, and other people saying no, you're dealing with modern readers, so there's that issue. So it was just helpful that she had a little bit of distance. In terms of getting the Nisei voice correct, and I think what helped was the relationship. I think for me, my writing is all about relationship. So when to understand her relationship with her older sister, there's kind of historic things involved, cultural things, the One-san, where the older sister's place is in the immigrant family. There's those kind of things. But then there's also universal things about being a younger sister and being, led by your older sister that everyone could relate to. So I think with a Nisei story, you have to blend both because they're Americans, right? So they're going to have this kind of American sensibility about them too.
If you just have a few more minutes, so I would want to maybe end with asking you about what you're working on now. I mean, you mentioned, we'll be seeing Aki again, but what else are you working on, and what would you like to do at some point, whether you'll get to it or not? I have a list of like 20 things I'd like to do that I may not get to, but what about you?
Well, believe it or not, I'm doing a family memoir right now. I'm finishing one up. I thought I wouldn't do them anymore because, that's kind of like a side gig. But I'm doing one on a Taiwanese man who's 88 years old. This is the first non-JA that I've done.
Right.
Fascinating, learning so much about Taiwan, and his heart language is Japanese because of the colonialization of Taiwan. That's what he speaks to his friends, his childhood friends. So it's, I wasn't sure if I had time to do this, and I'm not going to do any more after this. But I will say this, that I'm happy at times where I've said yes to these projects. They're not high profile projects. I said yes to this dear gentleman. He's passed away now, who he wrote about Uptown, and he also wrote about judo. He wasn't a historian. He just did judo in the Uptown dojo, no, it was Seinan dojo. And then from there, I learned about this Japanese couple who had come to America to teach Teddy Roosevelt jujitsu. And the wife came and she taught these White House, ladies, high society ladies. So I'm planning to write a book about that.
Wow.
Because it's just so weird. And then I'm going to be using like Monica Trong. She, a Vietnamese American writer, she's kind of gone into the voice of these individuals who are kind of on the periphery of history, and kind of using that as a guide for me to like get into like this woman's head. So, and then I'm going to be writing a book about Pasadena, historical novel, because that's where I live. And right now
set in the JA community or in Pasadena, or
involving JAs and more, but because again, it's the Japanese gardens, that were prominent here.
Right.
And I recently have a short story coming out with the Mystery Writers of America. It's called Grand Garden, and it's about a Japanese Nisei boy who has to live in this Japanese garden that people gain entrance by giving a nickel, and how it suffocates him. It's very dark. Yeah, it's super, super dark.
I mean, is that based, because that really happened, right, in a couple places.
Yeah.
Families living in kind of living exhibits in kind of Japanese gardens.
So this is kind of like the dark side.
Yeah.
So that's
that just sounds pretty dark overall.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, we're about at time, so people have to go back to work. So thank you so much for doing this. This was great. I hope you're looking at the comments, because lots of enthusiastic comments from the audience. Just want to thank the Tadaima team for allowing us to be a part of it, and to our friends at Densho, Nina Wallace and Natasha Varner have been behind the scenes running the program. Again, we're partnering with Elliott Bay Books on this, so look for the novel, Clark and Division, and Naomi's other works. And yeah, thanks so much.